Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to talk about one of the many crises the European Union is facing, the distrust of its citizens. It's hard to speak these days about a crisis and not speak about coronavirus, but there are many issues that we can mention when speaking about crisis in Europe that could actually explain a growing disenchantment with the EU. A survey from the Eurobarometer about emotions and political engagement towards the EU was conducted last year, right before the European parliamentary elections. And when asked about what feeling first comes to mind when they think of the EU, over half of respondents had positive feelings about the EU. 28% said they feel hope, while almost the same proportion of respondents said they feel confidence, 27%. At the same time, a third of those surveyed, this is the 33%, said they had doubts when they think of the EU. Also, according to the survey, a large majority of respondents thought that what brings European citizens together is more important than what separates them, and 80% actually. Nevertheless, this vision seems quite positive to me, considering that according to a survey from the same year, conducted by the European Commission, the distrust to the EU in France and Greece is even bigger than in the UK. In fact, this survey shows that the majority of the people distrusts the EU in 10 member states. A report from 2018 from the European Commission, which is called The Geography of European Union Discontent, describes how public opinion of the EU has deteriorated over the last 15 years, how anti-EU votes have grown, and how this is linked to voting for populist parties. In this analysis, there are three different levels of EU opposition: strongly opposed, opposed, and somewhat opposed. The results indicate that the anti-EU vote is mainly driven by a combination of long-term economic and industrial decline, low levels of education, and a lack of local employment opportunities. However, we can mention many other issues that have damaged the EU's image, like the catastrophic management of Greek public debt, the migratory crisis, and the consequent transformation of the Mediterranean Sea into the world's deadliest border, the advance of the extreme right in Europe, Russia's interference in its presumed attempts to destabilize the West, and of course, we cannot forget Brexit, and the 31st of January, when the European Union became a decline in Europe. Whereas before, there used to be a waiting list in order to join this club. In fact, the 31st of January, all Europe was looking at the UK, instead of paying attention to the then new disease called coronavirus, which brings us to the latest problem that the EU needs to face. The situation triggered by coronavirus is clearly undermining the European citizens' trust in the institutions. We know how divided the Union towards this issue is. It is probably more difficult in moments like this to trust the Union, because actually the EU as a club, it was not conceived for bad times. We can see it if we think about the global financial crisis that has started in 2008. Of course, you know that I'm talking about the Great Recession. Now we can read headlines from different newspapers in this sense. Where's the EU when facing coronavirus, says El Confidencial. The Daily Telegraph says, will the coronavirus crisis tear the EU apart? And a headline I found in the Guardian says, "Coronavirus could be final straw for EU, European experts warn." Personally, I won't deny the lack of leadership that we could have expected from the European Commission. But still, on the one hand, I like to remind that the European institutions don't have competences in the area of healthcare, because this belongs to the member states. And on the other hand, I think the lack of solidarity we have seen these days could be attributed to some states and not to the European institutions. However, I like to end on a positive note. After the quarrel and the failure of the EU leaders to agree a unified response to the pandemic, it seems that finally Brussels is launching new measures and proposing a 100,000 million fund to help Spain and Italy. I sincerely hope that the EU can finally come out of the crisis stronger, so that it ceases to be something difficult to understand and too far from the citizens. Thank you very much.